Dickens and the Railway, a case study of Dombey and Son. Context. Charles Dickens was born in 1812, and he would have been 18 when the first railways were being built in the 1830s. Scholars believe that he took his first railway journey around 1838, most likely from London to Birmingham. The writing of Dombey and Son coincided with the Great Railway Boom of 1843 to 1847. Critics have debated what Dickens' own attitude to the expansion of the railways was, but most have come to the conclusion that he was largely ambivalent towards them. Dickens himself was a victim of a railway smash in 1865, after Dombey and Son was published, when he travelled on a train which suffered a derailment at Staplehurst in Kent. So what was the Great Railway Boom? It was a period of intense economic growth in the 1840s. The fastest methods of transport had previously been canals, which often froze in cold weather or dried up in hot weather. The other alternative was horse and coach, which was much slower than train travel. An economic bubble was created from this hype over the revolutionary new technology, and over 1,000 new individual railway lines were built between 1843 and 1847, costing over £200 million. The railway changed Britain's landscape dramatically, as the railways carved up the nation's countryside. In Mugby Junction, Dickens strikingly describes the railways as a work of extraordinary ground spiders that spun iron. In one case, companies were given permission to cut through the historic ruins of Furness Abbey. The violent expansion of the railways can be seen in the digging up of Stagg's Garden when Paul and Florence visit the Tudors. This period of intense development went on without much regulation from the government, leading to several catastrophic railway accidents. How is it represented in Dombey and Son? There are four key passages in which the railway appear in Dombey and Son. The first is the building of the London and Birmingham Railway at Stagg's Garden in Chapter 6. The second is the aftermath of the building of the railway at Stagg's Garden in Chapter 15. The third is Mr. Dombey's journey to Leamington Spa after Paul's death in Chapter 20. And the fourth is Mr. Carker's death, in which he falls into the path of an oncoming express train in Chapter 55. A case study of Chapter 20. Away with a shriek and a roar and a rattle from the town, burrowing among the dwellings of men and making the streets hum, flashing out into the meadows for a moment, mining in through the damp earth, booming on in the darkness and heavy air, bursting out again into the sunny day so bright and wide, away with a shriek and a roar and a rattle, through the fields, through the woods, through the corn, through the hay, through the chalk, through the mould, through the clay, through the rock, among objects close at hand and almost in the grasp, ever flying from the traveller, and a deceitful distance ever moving slowly within him, like as in the track of the remorseless monster, death. Louder and louder yet it shrieks and cries as it comes tearing on resistless to the goal, and now its way, still like the way of death, is strewn with ashes thickly. Everything around is blackened. There are dark pools of water, muddy lanes, and miserable habitations far below. There are jagged walls and falling houses close at hand, and through the battered roofs and broken windows, wretched rooms are seen, where want and fever hide themselves in many wretched shapes, while smoke and crowded gables, and distorted chimneys, and deformative brick and mortar panning up deformative mind and body, choke the murky distance. As Mr. Dombey looks out of his carriage window, it's never in his thoughts that the monster who has brought him there has let the light of day in on these things, not made or caused them. It was a journey's fitting end, and might have been the end of everything, it was so ruinous and dreary. Structural analysis. It's useful to bear in mind that the Victorian fascination of the train had a great deal to do with two things, speed and power. These two elements seem to affect the structure of this extract. Dickens moves away from his traditional narrative style in something much closer to poetry. Look at the structure of this sentence. Away with a shriek and a roar and a rattle, from the two, burrowing among the dwellings of men and making the streets hum. Compare this to his usual writing style, and a very stark difference appears. The imagery melds together with the structure of the sentence. The subject is altering the framework in which it's represented. Moreover, he rhymes hay and clay. Aside from the onomatopoeic poetic sounds of the individual words, shriek, rattle, and hum, the whole sentence has a structural rhythm similar to that of the train. The clackety-clack sound of a train running over tracks is mirrored by the syntactical structure of the sentence. The quick run-on structure also emphasises the changing landscape which Mr. Dombey sees from the train window. The description shifts rapidly from urban areas to rural areas to agricultural areas, where the factory is smoking, where the stream is running, where the village clusters, where the great cathedral rises. Look at how active this extract is as well. Every location the train passes is defined by a verb. Movement and action are vital to this sentence and give the extract a sense of dynamism. The train gave the people a whole new way of looking at the landscape, and this new perspective is evident here. Thematic analysis. This passage is directly after the death of Mr. Dombey's only son, Paul, and the influence of death can be seen across the entire extract. Dickens repeatedly and directly links the train with death, like as in the track of that indomitable monster, Death. Death is a monstrous, unstoppable force here. Moreover, it is a dominating one, emphasised by the fact that Dickens capitalises the word. There is very evident violence in the way in which Dickens describes the train. Despite the progressive space the train occupies, in that it is transporting Mr. Dombey forward, it does seem like a very violent force as it tears through the landscape. The landscape itself becomes very macabre as the train passes through. Through the battered roofs and broken windows, wretched rooms are seen. The whole extract has an air of disease and sickness about it. It isn't a symbol of modernity and progress, rather one of sickness and degradation. This, of course, mirrors the sickly nature of Mr. Dombey's recently deceased son. Dickens makes it clear that it is the railway which is spreading this blackness. Everything around is blackened. There are dark pools of water, muddy lanes. The train is a dirty, polluting force. What do the critics say? The narrative perspective in this extract throws up a number of interesting questions about the nature of Dickens's narration. The essential question is this: does this description foreshadow the death of Mr. Carker, who is himself run over by a train? Some critics have stated that it is simply a description, albeit a brilliant one, and does not foreshadow anything. Dickens is renowned for his journalistic detail. For a long time he worked as a journalist. Jack Symonds argues that Dickens' account of the journey is no confused phantasmagoria. It is quite precise, showing the passage of the train through the chalk, through the mould, through the clay, and through the rock. However, Ian Carter disagrees and thinks that there is more going on in this extract and that it foreshadows the death of Mr. Dombey's manager, Mr. Carker. He states that this passage is an open pre-echo for Mr. Carker's death, with its carefully planned train of ashes, 450 pages before the villain dies. What do you think? Here is the extract which contains Mr. Carker's grisly death. Compare the representation of the train between the two texts. He heard a shout. Another saw the face change from its vindictive passion to a faint sickness and terror, felt the earth tremble, knew in a moment that the rush was come, uttered a shriek, looked round, saw the red eyes bleared and dim in the daylight close upon him, was beaten down, caught up, and whirled away upon a jagged mill that spun him round and struck him limb from limb, and licked his stream of life up in its fiery heat, and cast his mutilated fragments in the air. What do you think? Is there a direct foreshadowing between these two passages, or are they both extracts from a novel which has several vivid and separate representations of the train? Naturally, in a novel everything is planned, so nothing could be coincidental. However, the question of direct foreshadowing unlocks a useful way to consider a novel like this. The golden rule of criticism is that there is no right or wrong answer. The disclaimer for the no wrong answer rule is that you must always have evidence to support your statements. If you're going to draw similarities between the two paragraphs, make sure they're detailed, interesting, and, above all, convincing. If you're going to argue that the two passages are different, point out the ways in which they are, on a structural and a thematic level. One could argue that this extract is more about sickness and about Paul's death than violence. It's about mourning, not about the danger of the railways. Contrastingly, you could argue that the passage could just be about both. That merely by representing a train through the prism of death, it indirectly foreshadows the death of Mr. Carker. Again, look at the way in which Carker's death is presented. It is, largely, first person. It differs in a number of ways to the scene with Mr. Dombey. In conclusion, setting aside the question of foreshadowing, the railway in Dombey and Son is, most of all, an object of violent change. Dickens's ambivalent attitude toward the railway allows a number of different interpretations to be made upon the text. There is no message about the train in Dombey and Son, and across Dickens's work as a whole. Rather than a complication, this should be seen as liberating. It's impossible to analyse a text on the basis of what a writer was feeling or thinking when they wrote it. Instead, analyse the extract on a textual level. Remove the writer from the equation and focus on how the words and sentences combine to create an effect, and what effect that is. In the particular extract we've looked at, the emphasis is placed upon the violence of the train. It is presented as an unstoppable monster, synonymous with death. Dickens uses it to represent grief in the case of Mr. Dombey, but also violence in the case of Mr. Carker. And in other areas of Donbin's Son, it is presented in a more peaceful way. Though the initial shock at Stagg's Garden is like that of a great earthquake, after the construction is completed, the change is seen to be positive. Stagg's Garden has been rejuvenated by the presence of the railway. In a number of different ways, the railways in Dombey and Son are a force for change, whether it is positive or negative.